Sometimes the things people mock you for turn out to be blessings in disguise. At 60 years old, Jedediah Boone had learned not to let the town's laughter cut too deep. When he inherited his cousin's broken-down cabin in the pines, folks in Pine Ridge had a good laugh. The old shack sat crooked, windows busted out, yard full of rusted metal and tires. Jed didn't mind their snickers. He'd lived alone with his dog Buck for years, finding peace in the mountain quiet. 3 days after moving in, Buck started scratching at the rotten floorboards. When the old hound let out a howl that shook the valley, Jed knew something was different. Under those broken planks was a chest filled with gold coins, old maps, and letters that would change his life forever. What secrets had his cousin been hiding all those years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the tall pines surrounding Pine Ridge, casting long shadows across the dirt road that wound its way up toward the old Boone property. Jedediah pulled his weathered pickup truck to a stop beside the mailbox that leaned at a precarious angle, its red paint peeling like sunburned skin. The name E. Boone was barely visible beneath layers of mountain weather and neglect. Buck, his chocolate-colored hound, lifted his grizzled muzzle from the passenger seat and sniffed the air with interest. At 12 years old, the dog had been Jed's constant companion through thick and thin, and his instincts had never steered them wrong. Something about this place seemed to capture Buck's attention in a way that made Jed take notice. "Well, old boy," Jed said, scratching behind Buck's ears, "this is it, our new home courtesy of Cousin Ezra." Ezra Boone had been a name whispered in hushed tones around Pine Ridge for as long as anyone could remember. Some folks said he'd been a prospector back in the day. Others claimed he'd been involved in less savory pursuits. What everyone agreed on was that Ezra had been a strange man who kept to himself up in the mountains, rarely coming to town except for supplies. When word spread that he'd passed away and left his property to a distant cousin nobody had heard of, it became the talk of Miller's General Store for weeks. Jed stepped out of the truck and surveyed his inheritance with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent his life making do with what he had. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that had probably been growing since before the first settlers arrived. The structure itself told a story of neglect and time's relentless march. The roof sagged in the middle like an old horse's back, and several shingles had given up their fight against the elements, leaving dark patches where rain had found its way inside. The front porch tilted at an angle that defied basic carpentry, supported by posts that had seen better decades. Windows stared out like empty eye sockets, their glass long since shattered by storms or stones. Around the cabin's perimeter, the detritus of a solitary life lay scattered like memories. Rusted car parts, old tires that had become planters for weeds, pieces of machinery whose original purpose had been forgotten by time. Buck jumped down from the truck and immediately began exploring, his nose working overtime as he catalogued the scents of his new territory. Jed watched his companion with affection, noting how the dog's tail wagged with cautious optimism. If Buck approved of a place, that was good enough for Jed. The walk to the front door required careful navigation around holes in the porch boards and a missing step that had rotted away completely. The door itself hung askew on rusty hinges, and Jed had to lift it slightly to get it open. The screech of protesting metal announced his arrival to any creatures that might have taken up residence in his absence. Inside, the cabin revealed the simple life Ezra had lived. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living area all in one. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires, but still solid as the mountains themselves. The furniture was sparse but functional. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs that had been mended more than once, and a rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light from the east-facing window. The kitchen consisted of a hand pump over a deep sink, open shelves that held a few dishes and cooking implements, and a wood-burning stove that had probably been installed sometime during the Eisenhower administration. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but underneath, Jed could see that Ezra had kept his home clean and organized in his own way. A narrow staircase led to what Jed assumed was a sleeping loft, though the upper floor remained shrouded in afternoon shadows. For now, he focused on the immediate task of making the place habitable. The first order of business would be assessing what worked and what needed fixing, a mental inventory that came naturally to a man who'd spent his life solving problems with his hands. Jed had learned self-reliance early in life. Born and raised in the mountains of Kentucky, he'd grown up in a family where making do and fixing things yourself wasn't just practical, it was survival. His father had been a coal miner who spent his off hours teaching his son the value of hard work and honest living. When the mines closed and the work dried up, Jed had joined the military, serving 2 tours in Vietnam as a combat engineer. The army had taught him skills that served him well in civilian life. How to assess a situation quickly, how to work with limited resources, and how to stay calm under pressure. After his discharge, he'd wandered west, picking up work wherever he could find it: construction, logging, ranch hand, even a stint as a fire lookout in the Montana wilderness. It was during his years as a lookout that Jed had discovered his love for solitude and the honest company of a good dog. He'd found Buck as a puppy, abandoned at a rest stop, and the two had been inseparable ever since. They'd lived simply, moving from place to place as work required, never accumulating much beyond what they could fit in the truck. The letter from the lawyer in Pine Ridge had come as a complete surprise. Jed had barely known Ezra existed, let alone that they were related closely enough to warrant an inheritance. The family tree on his father's side had always been a mystery, full of branches that had grown apart over generations and distances. Apparently, Ezra had done his research and decided that Jed was the closest thing to family he had left. Now, standing in the dim interior of his inherited cabin, Jed felt the weight of unexpected responsibility. This wasn't just a place to live. It was a piece of family history, a connection to roots he'd never known he had. The thought stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years, the desire to belong somewhere, to put down roots of his own. Buck's sudden bark from outside interrupted his reverie. Jed stepped back onto the porch to find his dog at the edge of the clearing, tail wagging as he faced the dirt road. In the distance, a plume of dust announced the approach of visitors. The first vehicle to emerge from the pine trees was a patrol car bearing the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department logo. Behind it came a pickup truck that had seen better years, followed by what appeared to be half the town's population in various stages of automotive decline. Word traveled fast in small mountain communities, and apparently the arrival of Ezra's heir was news worth investigating. Sheriff Tom Grayson stepped out of the patrol car. A man in his 50s, whose steady demeanor and careful movements spoke of someone who'd learned to handle situations with patience rather than force. He approached with a friendly nod, his hand extended in greeting. "You must be Jedediah Boone," he said, his handshake firm and honest. "Tom Grayson, County Sheriff, heard you'd be arriving today. Thought I'd stop by and welcome you to Pine Ridge." "Much obliged, Sheriff," Jed replied, appreciating the man's straightforward manner. "Please, call me Jed." The other vehicles disgorged their passengers, curious townspeople who'd found reasons to drive up the mountain road on this particular afternoon. There was Martha Henderson from the diner, her gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Joe Miller, who ran the general store, stood with his hands in his pockets, clearly enjoying the novelty of the situation. A handful of other faces that Jed didn't recognize completed the informal welcoming committee. "Quite a place old Ezra had here," commented Joe Miller, his tone carefully neutral. "Been meaning to check on it since he passed. Good to see it'll have someone living in it again." The polite conversation that followed revealed the complex relationship the townspeople had with Ezra's memory. He'd been part of their community for decades, yet remained an outsider by choice. They respected his privacy, but couldn't help being curious about the man who'd lived alone on the mountain, with only occasional trips to town for supplies. Ezra was a good neighbor, Sheriff Grayson explained as the impromptu gathering began. To disperse. Kept to himself mostly, but he'd lend a hand when folks needed it. Fixed Mrs. Patterson's roof after that bad storm 3 years back. Wouldn't take a dime for it. Think you'll find people here are willing to do the same for you, long as you're the sort who appreciates good neighbors. As the last of the vehicles disappeared back down the mountain road, Jed found himself alone with Buck and the settling quiet of the pine forest. The social obligations of the day complete, he could finally focus on the practical matters at hand. The afternoon light was beginning to slant toward evening when Jed started his systematic exploration of the property. The cabin's interior revealed more of Ezra's character with each room examined. The man had been methodical, organized, and surprisingly well-read. A bookshelf in the main room held volumes on geology, local history, and what appeared to be technical, manuals on mining and prospecting. The sleeping loft proved to be larger than expected, with a sturdy bed and a desk positioned beneath a small window that looked out over the valley. On the desk lay a journal, its leather cover worn smooth by handling. Jed hesitated before opening it, sensing that he was about to intrude on private thoughts, but his curiosity won out. The entries were sporadic, written in a careful hand that spoke of deliberate thought. They spoke of weather patterns, wildlife observations, and occasional musings about the changing world beyond the mountains. One entry, dated just 2 months before Ezra's death, caught Jed's attention. The old ways are passing. Time to make sure the important things don't get lost with them. As darkness began to settle over the mountain, Jed built his first fire in Ezra's fireplace. The chimney drew well, and soon the cabin was filled with warmth and the comforting crackle of burning pine. Buck settled on a rug in front of the hearth, content to watch the flames dance while his master continued exploring their new home. It was then that Buck's behavior changed in a way that would alter everything. Buck had always been a calm dog, steady in his temperament and predictable in his habits. In all their years together, Jed had rarely seen him display anything more than mild curiosity about his surroundings. So when the old hound began pacing restlessly around the cabin's main room, his nose pressed to the floor as if following an invisible trail, Jed knew something was amiss. "What is it, boy?" Jed asked, setting down the cup of coffee he'd brewed on Ezra's ancient stove. The dog's behavior had started shortly after sunset, and now, 2 hours later, Buck showed no signs of settling down for the night. The hound moved with purpose, circling the room in a pattern that seemed random at first, but gradually revealed itself to have a focus. Buck kept returning to a particular area near the fireplace, where the floorboards looked slightly different from the rest. The wood there was newer, or perhaps simply better preserved, as if it had been replaced more recently than the surrounding planks. Jed knelt beside his dog and ran his hand over the boards in question. They felt solid enough, but there was something about them that didn't quite match the rest of the floor. The grain ran in a slightly different direction, and the spacing between the planks was just a fraction wider. To a casual observer, the difference would be invisible, but to someone who'd spent his life working with wood and fixing things, the subtle variations told a story. "You're on to something, aren't you, Buck?" The dog responded by scratching at the edge of one particular board, his claws finding purchase in what appeared to be a barely visible seam. As Buck continued his investigation, Jed noticed that the nails holding this section of flooring weren't hammered flush with the wood like the others. They sat just proud enough to suggest they'd been driven in and removed more than once. Rising from his crouch, Jed looked around the cabin for tools. Ezra had left behind a modest collection of hand tools in a wooden box near the back door. a hammer, several screwdrivers, a pry bar, and other implements of basic maintenance. Jed selected the pry bar and returned to where Buck waited with barely contained excitement. The first board came up easier than expected, confirming Jed's suspicion that this section of flooring had been designed for access rather than permanence. Beneath the planks lay not the dirt foundation he'd expected, but a carefully constructed wooden compartment, perhaps 2 feet square, and lined with oiled canvas to protect its contents from moisture. Buck's whining grew more insistent as the treasure chest came into view. It was smaller than Jed had imagined from the dog's discovery in his memory, but unmistakably real. The chest itself was made of dark wood, possibly walnut, with brass corners and a simple but sturdy lock. Its surface bore the patina of age, but showed no signs of decay or damage. Jed lifted the chest from its hiding place, surprised by its weight. Whatever lay inside was substantial. He carried it to the table and set it down under the light of the kerosene lamp he'd lit earlier. Buck positioned himself nearby, his tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. The lock appeared to be original to the chest, a simple mechanism that spoke of an era when craftsmanship mattered more than complexity. Jed examined it carefully, looking for any signs of a key nearby, but found none. The lock was old enough that a skilled hand with the right tools could probably work it open without too much difficulty. Returning to Ezra's tool collection, Jed found a set of thin metal implements that looked like they might have been designed for precisely this sort of delicate work. As he worked on the lock mechanism, he reflected on the irony of using a dead man's tools to open the same man's secrets. The lock yielded to patient effort, clicking open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. The lid opened, smoothly on well-maintained hinges, revealing contents that took Jed's breath away. The chest was divided into several compartments, each holding items that spoke of a life far more complex than the simple mountain hermit the townspeople had known. In the largest compartment lay a collection of gold coins, their surfaces gleaming despite their obvious age. Some bore dates from the 1800s, others were foreign in origin, suggesting travels or transactions that extended far beyond Pine Ridge. Beside the coins sat a leather pouch containing what appeared to be uncut gemstones, rough emeralds, sapphires and stones Jed couldn't identify, but which caught the lamplight with unmistakable value. A second compartment held papers, maps drawn on heavy paper, some appearing to be official survey documents, while others looked hand-drawn. The maps showed areas Jed recognized as local terrain, but with markings and notations that suggested knowledge far beyond what a casual resident would possess. Creek beds were marked with symbols, elevation changes noted with precision, and several locations were circled in red ink with cryptic annotations. The third compartment contained letters, bound with a faded ribbon and written in various hands. The topmost letter bore an address in Denver and a date from 15 years earlier. The envelope was addressed to E. Boone, but the return address belonged to someone named Samuel Morrison, identified as representing Morrison and Associates, Geological. Surveyed, Jed opened the letter with careful hands, aware that he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. The contents would make him complicit in whatever secrets Ezra had kept, but his curiosity had passed the point of restraint. The letter was professional in tone, but warm in its familiarity. It referenced a previous meeting and confirmed arrangements for what was described as the continuation of our mutual project. The language was carefully neutral, but between the lines, Jed could read the implication of ongoing business relationships and significant financial transactions. More intriguing was a paragraph near the end. As we discussed, the geological indicators remain promising. The preliminary assays confirm what your grandfather's notes suggested, though the scale may be larger than any of us anticipated. I continue to recommend discretion until we can complete the full survey. Jed set the letter aside and examined the maps more carefully. The symbols and markings began to make sense when viewed in the context of geological survey work. The circled areas corresponded to locations that showed specific mineral indicators, and the careful notations suggested systematic exploration over a period of years. One map in particular caught his attention. It showed the immediate area around the cabin in remarkable detail, including topographical features that weren't visible from ground level. More significantly, it showed a series of marks leading from the cabin site toward an area marked simply as Site A, about 2 miles up the mountain. Buck, who had settled down during Jed's examination of the chest's contents, suddenly raised his head and growled low in his throat. The sound made Jed look up from the maps, his senses immediately alert. Living alone in remote areas had taught him to trust his dog's instincts about potential danger. The growl continued, and Buck moved toward the front window, his hackles raised. Jed carefully closed the chest and moved to where he could peer out into the darkness beyond the porch. The night was moonless, and the surrounding pine forest created deep shadows that could hide almost anything. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then far down the mountain road, he caught a glimpse of light moving through the trees. Headlights, but moving without the steady progression of normal traffic. The light would appear, disappear behind trees, then reappear somewhere it shouldn't be if the vehicle were following the road. Someone was moving through the forest with deliberate stealth, using a vehicle but avoiding the obvious routes. In Jed's experience, people who moved like that usually had reasons they preferred not to share with others. Buck's growling intensified, and Jed made a decision that would prove wise in the hours to come. He quickly returned the chest to its hiding place beneath the floorboards, replaced the planks, and scattered the tools back to their original locations. Whatever was happening outside, he didn't want to be found with Ezra's secrets spread across the table. The mysterious lights continued their careful progress through the forest for another 20 minutes before disappearing entirely. Buck eventually relaxed, but remained more alert than usual as Jed banked the fire and prepared for his first night in the cabin. As he lay in Ezra's bed, listening to the familiar sounds of Buck settling on the floor nearby, Jed's mind raced with questions. The chest's contents had transformed his understanding of both Ezra and his inheritance completely. The broken-down cabin was apparently a facade, hiding wealth and secrets that someone else might be very interested in recovering. The mysterious nocturnal visitors suggested that Jed wasn't the only one who knew about Ezra's hidden assets. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could change his life forever, but tonight, sleep would be elusive as he contemplated the magnitude of what Buck had uncovered. Dawn came slowly to the mountain, filtering through the pine boughs with a hesitant light that seemed to match Jed's own uncertainty about the day ahead. He'd slept fitfully, his dreams filled with maps and mysterious lights moving through dark forests. Buck had remained alert throughout the night, occasionally raising his head to listen to sounds that Jed's aging ears couldn't detect. The first order of business was coffee, strong and black, brewed in Ezra's old percolator on the wood stove. As the familiar ritual grounded him in the present moment, Jed found his mind turning to practical considerations. The treasure chest had changed everything, but life still required the basic necessities of food, water, and safety. A trip to town was unavoidable. His supplies were limited to what he'd brought in the truck, and winter in the mountains demanded better preparation than his current circumstances allowed. More importantly, he needed to understand more about Ezra and the community his cousin had lived in for so many years. Buck accompanied him on the drive down the mountain, his usual enthusiasm for car rides tempered by a watchfulness that hadn't been there before the previous night's discovery. The dog seemed to sense that their situation had become more complex, requiring a level of caution that went beyond his normal protective instincts. Pine Ridge's main street consisted of perhaps a dozen buildings, most of them dating back to the town's origins as a logging and mining community. Miller's General Store occupied the central position, its wide front porch serving as an unofficial gathering place for locals who had the time to watch the world go by. The diner sat next door, its windows already steamed from the breakfast. Crowds activity. Jed parked in front of the general store and left Buck in the truck with the windows cracked. The dog would be his early warning system if anyone showed unusual interest in either the vehicle or its occupants. The store's interior retained the character of an earlier era, with wide plank floors that creaked companionably underfoot and shelves that reached toward a high ceiling. Joe Miller looked up from behind the counter where he'd been sorting through a delivery of canned goods. "Mornin', Jed. How'd your first night go up at the old place?" "Quiet enough," Jed replied, selecting a shopping basket and beginning to gather basic supplies. "Takes some getting used to, living in someone else's space." Joe nodded with understanding. Ezra kept that place in good shape, considering. "Surprised more folks don't try to buy up the old cabins in these mountains. Good land, and the privacy can't be beat." The comment seemed casual, but Jed detected an undercurrent of curiosity. Small towns thrived on information, and his arrival represented a break in the usual routine that naturally generated questions. "Speaking of Ezra," Jed said, loading canned goods into his basket, "I'm trying to get a sense of the man. Seems like he was well regarded around here." "Oh, he was that. Kept to himself mostly, but folks respected him. Always paid his bills on time, never caused trouble." Joe paused in his sorting, his expression growing more thoughtful. "Matter of fact, he was better educated than most folks realized. Used to help the school kids with their science projects when they needed someone who understood geology and such." This revelation added another layer to Ezra's character. The man had possessed expertise that went beyond simple mountain living. Yet he'd chosen to use it quietly, helping children rather than pursuing whatever opportunities such knowledge might have provided. "Did he ever mention family?" Jed asked, hoping to learn more about the connections that had led to his inheritance. "Not directly, but I got the impression he'd done some traveling in his younger days. Sometimes he'd get packages from places, like Denver or Salt Lake City, official-looking things, you know? And every few months someone would come by asking directions to his place. Professional types, usually driving rental cars." The pattern Joe described matched the letters Jed had found in the chest. Ezra had maintained connections with people outside Pine Ridge, relationships that involved enough formality to require written correspondence and periodic visits. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martha Henderson from the diner. She bustled through the door with the energy of someone accustomed to managing multiple tasks simultaneously, her sharp eyes immediately taking in Jed's presence and the supplies he was gathering. "Well, if it isn't our new neighbor," she said, with a warmth that seemed genuine. "Joe, I hope you're taking good care of him. Man can't live on canned beans alone." "Actually," Jed said, "I was planning to stop by your place for breakfast. Cooking for one takes some adjustment." Martha's face lit up with the satisfaction of someone who'd identified a problem she could solve. "You come by whenever you need. A proper meal. Been feeding folks in this town for 23 years, and I've yet to meet someone who couldn't benefit from a good breakfast." The easy acceptance he encountered surprised Jed. He'd expected more suspicion, more questions about his background and intentions. Instead, the townspeople seemed willing to judge him based on his present behavior rather than his unknown past. After completing his shopping, Jed made his way to the diner, where Martha had already prepared what she called her new neighbor. Special: eggs, bacon, hash browns, and biscuits that were clearly made from scratch. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, served in heavy ceramic mugs that had probably been in use since the diner opened. While he ate, Jed listened to the conversations flowing around him. The morning crowd consisted mostly of men who worked in the logging industry or the few remaining mines that still operated in the area. Their talk centered on practical matters, weather predictions, equipment problems, and the eternal challenge of making a living from the land. One conversation caught his attention. Two men at a corner table were discussing recent activity in the area that struck them as unusual. Someone had been asking questions about old mining claims, particularly those dating back to the early 1900s. The inquiries had come from people who identified themselves as researchers, but their interest seemed more commercial than academic. "Thing is," one of the men was saying, "they seem to know more about the old claims than they should have. Asked specific questions about boundaries and access rights. Makes a man wonder what they're really after." Jed finished his breakfast and approached their table with the casual manner of someone making neighborly conversation. Couldn't help overhearing about mining claims. "I'm new to the area. Is that something folks around here still worry about?" The older of the two men, whose weathered hands marked him as someone who'd spent his life in physical labor, looked up with interest. "Name's Frank Patterson. You must be the fellow inherited Ezra's place." "That's right. Jed Boone." "Well, Jed, most of the old claims aren't worth much anymore, but there's always someone trying to make a quick dollar off land that's been worked over already. These researchers, though, they had maps and documentation that looked pretty official. Made. Some of us wonder if they knew something we didn't." The conversation continued for several minutes, revealing that the mysterious inquiries had been made within the past month, after Ezra's death, but before Jed's arrival. The timing suggested a connection that made Jed increasingly uncomfortable. When he finally returned to his truck, Buck greeted him with unusual agitation. The dog's behavior suggested that something had disturbed him during Jed's absence, though a quick survey of the truck revealed nothing obviously amiss. As they drove back up the mountain road, Jed found himself checking the rearview mirror more frequently than usual. The conversations in town had reinforced his growing suspicion that Ezra's secrets were known to others, and that his arrival in Pine Ridge might have triggered events beyond his control. The cabin looked exactly as he'd left it, but Buck's continued alertness suggested that appearances could be deceiving. As Jed unloaded his supplies, he made a mental note to examine the hiding place beneath the floorboards as soon as he was safely inside. The chest remained undisturbed beneath the floorboards, but Jed's relief was tempered by what he discovered when he examined the maps more carefully in daylight. The hand-drawn notations were more extensive than he'd realized the night before, and they told a story that explained both the mysterious researchers and the careful way Ezra had hidden his wealth. The largest map showed the entire Pine Ridge area with remarkable accuracy, including topographical details that could only have come from extensive surveying work. What made it extraordinary, however, were the symbols marking specific locations throughout the mountains. Some were simple X marks, others were more complex notations that appeared to indicate different types of findings. Most significantly, several locations were marked with dates spanning nearly 40 years, suggesting that Ezra had been conducting systematic exploration for decades. The pattern of marks traced what appeared to be a geological formation running through multiple properties, including several that extended beyond the boundaries of Ezra's own land. A smaller, more detailed map focused on the immediate area around the cabin. This one showed underground features, water tables, rock formations, and what appeared to be a network of natural caves or tunnels. One particular marking caught Jed's attention: a large X positioned about 2 miles uphill from the cabin with the notation "Primary Site, Confirm, 1987." The letters from the Geological Survey Company provided context for these markings. The correspondence revealed that Ezra had been working with professional geologists to document what appeared to be a significant mineral deposit. The language was technical, but the implications were clear. The land around Pine Ridge contained valuable resources that had remained largely unexploited. More troubling was a letter dated just 6 months before Ezra's death. The tone was different from the earlier correspondence, carrying an undercurrent of urgency. The geologist, Samuel Morrison, expressed concern about increased interest from outside parties and recommended that Ezra consider formalizing the claims before others become aware of the opportunity. The final letter in the collection was the most revealing. Written just 2 months before Ezra's death, it confirmed that formal mining claims had been filed for 3 specific sites, with Ezra listed as the primary claimant. The letter included copies of the official documentation and a warning that recent inquiries suggest our work has attracted attention from parties who may not respect the proper legal channels. Jed sat back in Ezra's rocking chair, the weight of his inheritance settling on him like a physical burden. He'd inherited not just a cabin and some hidden treasure, but active mining claims that could be worth substantial money. More concerning was the clear indication that others knew about these claims and were actively seeking to gain access to them. The sound of Buck's low growling brought him back to immediate concerns. The dog was positioned at the front window, his attention focused on something outside. This time, Jed could see what had caught Buck's attention. A late-model SUV was parked at the bottom of the drive, partially hidden by the trees. 2 men had gotten out of the vehicle and were walking up the dirt road toward the cabin. Their clothing marked them as outsiders, city shoes that weren't designed for mountain terrain, business casual attire that suggested office work rather than outdoor activity. More significantly, they moved with the confident purposefulness of people who expected to be welcomed rather than the cautious approach of unexpected visitors. Jed quickly returned the maps and letters to the chest and secured it beneath the floorboards. By the time the men reached the porch, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, projecting the image of a man enjoying a quiet afternoon in his new home. The knock on the door was polite but firm. When Jed opened it, he found himself facing 2 men in their 40s, both carrying themselves with the smooth professionalism of people accustomed to negotiating business deals. Mr. Boone, the speaker, was tall and lean, with grey hair that suggested experience and authority. My name is David Kellerman, and this is my associate James Chen. We represent Consolidated Mining Resources. We were hoping we could have a few minutes of your time to discuss a business opportunity. The directness of their approach suggested they knew exactly why they were there, but Jed decided to project ignorance until he understood their intentions better. Business opportunity, he said, maintaining a tone of polite confusion. I'm afraid I don't understand. I just inherited this place a few days ago, still trying to figure out what I've got here. Kellerman's smile was practiced and reassuring. Of course, and we understand this must all be quite overwhelming. Your cousin Ezra was well known in certain circles for his geological expertise. We've been hoping to discuss some work he was involved in that might be of mutual interest. I'm afraid Ezra and I weren't close, Jed replied. Family grew apart over the years, you know how it is. I'm not sure I'd be much help with his business affairs. Chen spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested education at expensive schools. Perhaps we could come in and explain what we're proposing. I think you'll find it could be quite beneficial for everyone involved. Jed stepped aside to let them enter, noting how their eyes immediately began cataloguing the cabin's interior. Both men were clearly looking for something specific, though they tried to disguise their search as casual observation. Nice place, Kellerman commented, though his tone suggested he found the rustic accommodations less than impressive. Ezra certainly liked his privacy up here. Can I offer you coffee? Jed asked, using the hospitality ritual to buy time while he assessed their intentions. That would be great, Chen replied, settling into one of the chairs at the kitchen table. This really is beautiful country. Must be nice to get away from the modern world. As Jed prepared coffee, the men continued their casual conversation, but he could sense their growing impatience. They were clearly accustomed to more direct negotiations and seemed unsure how to handle someone who appeared genuinely ignorant of what they were seeking. Mr. Boone, Kellerman finally said, abandoning subtlety, We understand that your cousin was involved in some geological survey work in this area. Our company specializes in developing mineral resources, and we believe there might be opportunities here that could benefit everyone. What kind of opportunities? Jed asked, maintaining his pose of innocent curiosity. The kind that could set you up for life, Chen said with enthusiasm that seemed genuine. Ezra identified some very promising sites, and we have the resources to develop them properly. We're talking about the potential for significant ongoing income, far more than this land could generate through traditional uses. Kellerman nodded agreement. We're prepared to offer very generous terms for access rights. You'd retain ownership of the land while we handle all the technical and financial aspects of development. Think of it as a partnership where you provide the resource and we provide the expertise. The offer was seductive, and Jed could see how someone in his supposed position might find it appealing. A steady income from land that appeared to have little other value would solve most practical problems and provide security for the future. But the letters he'd read suggested that Ezra had been cautious about exactly these kinds of offers, and the mysterious lights in the forest suggested that not everyone interested in his claims was willing to negotiate through proper channels. It sounds interesting, Jed said carefully, but I'd need to understand a lot more before making any decisions. This is all pretty new to me. The men exchanged a glance that suggested they'd expected this response, but found it frustrating nonetheless. Of course, Kellerman said smoothly. We wouldn't expect you to make any immediate decisions. Perhaps we could arrange for you to meet with our technical team. They could explain the potential in terms that would be easier to understand. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with the men gradually revealing more about their knowledge of Ezra's work, while carefully avoiding any mention of specific locations or findings. By the time they left, Jed had a clear picture of the stakes involved and the sophisticated nature of the forces interested in his inheritance. As their SUV disappeared down the mountain road, Jed realized that his quiet retirement in the mountains had become something far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. The decision to explore Primary Site, confirmed 1987, came to Jed gradually over the following 3 days. The corporate visitors had left their business cards and a promise to return with more detailed proposals, but their urgency suggested they weren't the only ones interested in Ezra's discoveries. If he was going to understand what he'd inherited, he needed to see the evidence firsthand. Ezra's maps proved remarkably accurate. The route to the primary site led through terrain that would have been challenging for someone unfamiliar with mountain hiking, but the hand-drawn trail markers corresponded perfectly to natural landmarks. Buck seemed to enjoy the expedition, his energy returning to levels Jed hadn't seen since the dog's younger years. The path wound steadily upward through stands of pine and aspen, following what appeared to be an old game trail that had been subtly modified for human use. Someone, presumably Ezra, had cleared fallen logs and marked difficult passages with small cairns that blended so naturally with the environment that they would be invisible to casual hikers. After 2 miles of steady climbing, the trail opened into a clearing that showed clear signs of systematic exploration. The ground had been disturbed in several locations, with test holes dug at precise intervals and marked with weathered wooden stakes. At the far end of the clearing, a larger excavation revealed the mouth of what appeared to be a natural cave system. The cave entrance had been reinforced with timber supports, and electric lighting had been installed, using what looked like a portable generator system. The equipment was old, but well maintained, suggesting regular use over a period of years. A wooden sign near the entrance bore Ezra's name and the date of his original mining claim. Inside the cave, the evidence of Ezra's methodical approach became even more apparent. The passages had been mapped and marked, with different colored paint indicating various features of geological interest. Battery-powered lanterns provided illumination for what appeared to be a substantial underground complex. The most remarkable discovery lay approximately 50 yards into the main passage. The cave opened into a natural chamber where veins of mineral deposits were clearly visible in the rock walls. Even to Jed's untrained eye, the metallic gleam suggested valuable ore, and the extent of the veins indicated deposits that could be worth substantial money. More intriguing was the evidence that Ezra's exploration had been thorough and professional. Core samples had been taken at regular intervals, labeled and stored in organized containers. A notebook documented findings with the precision of someone who understood both geology and the legal requirements for establishing mining claims. The notebook's final entries, dated just 3 months before Ezra's death, revealed the magnitude of what had been discovered. Professional assays confirmed the presence of rare earth elements in concentrations that would make extraction commercially viable. The estimated value of the deposits ran into millions of dollars, assuming proper development and extraction techniques. But the notebook also documented Ezra's growing concerns about security. References to unauthorized surveys and boundary disputes suggested that others had become aware of the discovery and were taking steps to challenge Ezra's claims. The final entry was particularly ominous. Legal challenges increasing. May need to accelerate timeline. The implications were sobering. Ezra hadn't just discovered valuable mineral deposits. He'd been engaged in what appeared to be a race against time to establish and defend his legal rights to those deposits. His death had interrupted that process, leaving Jed to inherit not just wealth, but an active conflict with sophisticated opponents. The return trip to the cabin gave Jed time to process what he'd learned. The junk cabin the townspeople had mocked was actually the base of operations for a mining enterprise that could transform the economic landscape of the entire region. More concerning was the realization that he was now the primary obstacle between multiple interested parties and access to those resources. Buck's alert behavior during the hike back confirmed that they weren't alone in the mountains. The dogs, periodic stops and focused attention on specific areas suggested the presence of other people, though Jed never caught sight of anyone following them. The sensation of being watched was unmistakable, adding urgency to his need to understand the full scope of his situation. That evening, Jed made a decision that would prove crucial in the days ahead. Using Ezra's old rotary phone, he called the number on Samuel Morrison's business card, hoping to speak with the geologist who had been working with his cousin. The conversation that followed confirmed many of his suspicions, while raising new concerns about the forces arrayed against him. Morrison reached at his Denver office, expressed both surprise and relief to hear from Ezra's heir. "I was beginning to wonder what had happened to those claims," Morrison said. Ezra was very concerned about maintaining security, especially after we started getting inquiries from outside parties. "Has anyone approached you yet?" Jed described his encounters with both the corporate representatives and the mysterious nighttime surveillance. Morrison's response was immediate and alarmed. "That matches the pattern we were seeing before Ezra died. Someone has been conducting unauthorized surveys in the area, and they seem to know more about our findings than they should." Ezra suspected there might be a leak in one of the regulatory agencies, or possibly someone had gained access to his correspondence. The geologist went on to explain the legal complexities surrounding mining claims in the area. While Ezra's claims were properly filed and documented, they could be challenged on various technical grounds. More concerning was the possibility that competing claims could be filed for adjacent areas, potentially blocking access to the primary deposits. "The bottom line," Morrison said, "is that you're sitting on resources worth millions of dollars, but you're also in a race against time. If these outside parties can establish competing claims or find legal challenges to Ezra's work, they could tie things up in court for years while they develop alternative access routes." The conversation ended with Morrison offering to provide legal and technical support, but warning that the situation required immediate action. The window for protecting Ezra's claims was closing rapidly, and any delay could result in losing control of the discovery entirely. As Jed hung up the phone, he found himself facing a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could sell his inheritance to the corporate interests and walk away with enough money to live comfortably anywhere he chose. Alternatively, he could fight to maintain control of Ezra's discovery, potentially reaping far greater rewards, but also accepting significant risks. The choice was complicated by his growing attachment to Pine Ridge and its people. The community had accepted him with a warmth he hadn't experienced in years, offering the kind of belonging he'd been seeking without knowing it. Walking away would mean abandoning not just the mining claims, but the possibility of putting down roots in a place that felt like home. Buck's presence beside his chair provided comfort as Jed wrestled with the implications of his decision. The old dog had been his companion through many changes and challenges, offering the kind of loyalty that put human relationships to shame. Whatever choice he made, Buck would be there to see it through. The sound of vehicles on the mountain road interrupted his contemplation. This time, the headlights made no attempt at concealment, approaching the cabin directly and parking in full view. 3 vehicles disgorged men who moved with military precision toward the cabin, their intentions clearly different from those of the corporate representatives. As Jed watched them approach, he realized that the time for careful consideration had passed. The forces interested in Ezra's discovery had decided that negotiation was insufficient, and the situation was about to escalate beyond anything he'd experienced in his quiet mountain retirement. The men approaching the cabin moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit, but their equipment and demeanor suggested private security rather than government authority. Jed's years in the army had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate law enforcement and hired muscle, and these visitors clearly fell into the latter category. Buck's growling intensified as the footsteps reached the porch, but Jed placed a calming hand on the dog's head. Whatever was about to happen, he needed to project calm confidence rather than fear or aggression. The skills learned in Vietnam, assessing threats, maintaining composure under pressure, thinking tactically, came flooding back as if 40 years hadn't passed. The knock on the door was more demanding than polite, carrying an undertone of authority that expected immediate compliance. When Jed opened it, he found himself facing a man whose bearing screamed former military officer, now employed in less official capacity. "Mr. Boone," the man said without preamble, "I'm Marcus Webb, security consultant for Apex Development Group. We need to have a conversation about your current situation." Unlike the corporate representatives who had visited earlier, Webb made no pretense of friendliness or negotiation. His 2 companions flanked him in positions that provided clear sight lines while blocking potential escape routes. Their message was unmistakable. This wasn't a social call. "I'm not sure what situation you're referring to," Jed replied, maintaining the pose of innocent confusion that had served him well with the earlier visitors. "I'm just settling into my new home." Webb's smile was thin and humorless. "Mr. Boone, let's skip the amateur theater. We know about Ezra's mining claims, we know about the geological surveys, and we know you've been up to the primary site. What we need to discuss is how this situation gets resolved without unnecessary complications." The direct approach suggested that these men had been conducting surveillance far more extensive than Jed had realized. They knew about his exploration of the cave system, which meant they'd either been following him closely or had other sources of information about his activities. "Why don't you come in?" Jed said, stepping aside to admit them. The invitation wasn't motivated by hospitality, but by tactical considerations. Better to have the confrontation inside, where he had more control over the environment. The 3 men entered and immediately began what appeared to be a professional security assessment of the cabin's interior. Their eyes catalogued potential weapons, escape routes, and hiding places with the systematic thoroughness of people accustomed to hostile environments. Webb positioned himself where he could monitor both the front and back exits, while his companions took positions that effectively controlled the room. The choreography was smooth and practiced, suggesting they'd done this many times before. "Here's the situation," Webb began without waiting for an invitation to sit. "My employers have invested considerable resources in developing opportunities in this area. Your cousin's untimely death created some complications, but nothing that can't be managed with proper cooperation." "What kind of cooperation?" Jed asked, settling into Ezra's rocking chair with deliberate casualness. "The kind that recognizes reality." One of Webb's companions spoke for the first time. He was younger than Webb, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone who'd seen recent combat. "You're in over your head here, old man. This isn't about some weekend prospecting hobby." Webb silenced his associate with a sharp look. "What Tommy means is that this situation involves parties with significant resources and determination. The smart play is to work with us rather than against us." "And if I'm not interested in being smart?" Jed asked mildly. The question seemed to amuse Webb. "Then you might find that living alone on a remote mountain isn't as safe as you thought. Accidents happen, especially to people who don't understand their circumstances." The threat was delivered with professional casualness, but its implications were crystal clear. These men weren't interested in negotiation or legal resolution. They were prepared to use whatever methods necessary to achieve their objectives. Buck's continued growling provided an undercurrent of tension that seemed to make the younger man nervous. His hand moved unconsciously toward his jacket, where the outline of a concealed weapon was barely visible. "Nice dog," Webb commented, his tone suggesting that Buck's presence was more liability than asset. "Hope he's not the type to get protective." If things become unpleasant, the comment crystallized Jed's understanding of his situation. These men were prepared to escalate to violence, and they viewed both him and Buck as potential obstacles to be removed. The corporate representatives had offered carrots. These men were showing him the stick. "What exactly are you proposing?" Jed asked, buying time while he assessed his options. "Simple transfer of the mining claims to parties better equipped to develop them," Webb replied. "You sign the papers, we handle the legal details, and you receive fair compensation for your cooperation. Everyone wins. And if the compensation isn't what I consider fair..." Webb's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Boone, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of this conversation. We're not here to negotiate terms. We're here to explain realities. The claims are going to change hands one way or another. The only question is whether that happens through cooperation or through other means." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of another vehicle approaching the cabin. Webb's men immediately moved to positions where they could monitor the new arrival, their alertness suggesting they hadn't expected additional visitors. Through the window, Jed could see Sheriff Grayson's patrol car pulling up behind the 3 vehicles already parked in his yard. The timing was either remarkably fortunate or the result of careful planning on someone's part. Webb's expression showed the first signs of uncertainty since his arrival. Dealing with an isolated mountain man was one thing. Conducting intimidation in the presence of local law enforcement was considerably more complicated. "Expecting company?" Webb asked, his tone suggesting this development was unwelcome. "Not particularly," Jed replied truthfully, "but Sheriff Grayson mentioned he'd be checking on me periodically. Community policing, you know." The knock on the Duga was distinctly different from Webb's earlier demand for entry, firm but respectful, carrying the authority of legitimate law enforcement rather than hired intimidation. "Evening, Jed," Sheriff Grayson called through the door. "Saw all the vehicles and thought I'd make sure everything was all right up here." Webb's hand gesture silenced his men before they could respond to the sheriff's arrival. The situation had shifted dramatically, and professional security contractors couldn't afford to be involved in incidents with local law enforcement. "Everything's fine, Sheriff," Jed called back. "Just having a business discussion with some visitors. Mind if I come in for a minute? Like to meet anyone doing business in my jurisdiction." The request wasn't really a request, and everyone in the room understood that refusing would create exactly the kind of official attention Webb's employers wanted to avoid. "Of course," Jed replied, moving to open the door. Sheriff Grayson entered, with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with his authority. His presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room, transforming what had been an intimidation session into something that required more subtle approaches. "Gentlemen," the sheriff said, nodding politely to Webb and his men, "hope you're finding our mountain hospitality to your liking." Webb recovered his composure quickly. "Absolutely, Sheriff. Just discussing some potential business opportunities. With Mr. Boone. Beautiful country you have here." "That it is," Grayson agreed, his tone conversational, but his eyes alert. "Business opportunities, you said? What kind of business brings folks all the way up from wherever you're from?" The question was casual, but pointed, requiring Webb to provide information without appearing evasive. Jed could see the security consultant calculating his response, weighing the need to maintain his cover against the risk of providing details that could be verified later. "Development consulting," Webb replied smoothly. "My company specializes in helping property owners understand the potential of their land." "I see. And you drove all the way up here this evening to discuss development potential?" The sheriff's question highlighted the unusual timing and circumstances of the visit, subtly undermining Webb's explanation without directly challenging it. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in verbal chess, with both Webb and Sheriff Grayson probing for information while maintaining the facade of polite conversation. Jed found himself in the unexpected position of observer rather than target, watching two professionals circle each other with careful courtesy. The outcome was predetermined from the moment Grayson arrived. Webb and his men couldn't accomplish their objective under official scrutiny, and prolonging the encounter only increased their risk of exposure. After 15 minutes of increasingly strained pleasantries, they made their excuses and departed. As their vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, Sheriff Grayson turned to Jed with an expression that suggested the evening's events hadn't surprised him as much as they should have. "Those men weren't here to discuss development opportunities," Sheriff Grayson said, once the sound of engines had faded into the distance. His tone carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough deception to recognize it immediately. "No, they weren't," Jed agreed, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Coffee? I have a feeling this conversation might take a while." As Jed prepared fresh coffee, the sheriff settled into one of the chairs with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd been in this cabin before. The observation struck Jed as significant. Grayson moved through the space as if he knew its layout, suggesting a relationship with Ezra that went beyond casual law enforcement contact. "Sheriff," Jed began carefully, "those men seem to know quite a bit about my business, more than they should have, given that I only learned about it myself a few days ago." Grayson accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, then fixed Jed with a steady gaze that suggested the evening's revelations were just beginning. "Jed, there are some things about your inheritance that you need to understand. Things that Ezra asked me to keep confidential until the right person came along to hear them." The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that transformed everything Jed thought he knew about his situation. The sheriff's words suggested not just knowledge of Ezra's secrets, but active participation in protecting them. "What kind of things?" Jed asked, though he suspected the answer would complicate his life even further. Grayson stood and walked to the stone fireplace, running his hand along the mantelpiece until his fingers found what appeared to be a hidden catch. A section of the stonework swung inward, revealing a cavity that had been invisible moments before. Inside the hidden compartment lay a manila envelope bearing Jed's name in Ezra's careful handwriting. Beneath the envelope sat several items that immediately caught Jed's attention. A modern radio communication device, what appeared to be official government identification, and a small arsenal of equipment that belonged more in a spy novel than a mountain cabin. Your cousin wasn't just a prospector, Grayson said, retrieving the envelope and handing it to Jed. He was a retired federal agent who spent 30 years working deep cover operations for the Bureau. The mining claims were real, but they were also the perfect cover for something much more important. Jed opened the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside, he found a letter in Ezra's handwriting, along with copies of official documents that reframed everything he thought he understood about his inheritance. The letter began with an apology. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've inherited a situation that's more complicated than a simple mountain cabin. I'm sorry to drag you into this, but you were the only family I could trust with what I've spent the last decade protecting. What followed was a story that read like something from the Cold War era, but with implications that extended well into the present. Ezra hadn't just discovered valuable mineral deposits. He'd uncovered evidence of a sophisticated money laundering operation that used mining claims and geological surveys to move illegal funds through legitimate business channels. The operation involved foreign nationals using shell companies to purchase mining rights, then manipulating geological reports to justify massive investments that were actually vehicles for transferring money out of the country. The scheme was elegant in its complexity, using the legitimate mining industry as cover for financial crimes worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ezra's federal background had made him suspicious of the unusual activity around Pine Ridge, and his geological expertise had given him access to the technical aspects of the operation. Over a period of years, he documented a network that extended from local mining claims to international financial institutions. The men who visited you tonight, the letter continued, aren't just interested in the mineral deposits. They're part of a criminal organization that's been using this area to clean money for operations across the western United States. My death was supposed to end the investigation and clear the way for them to expand their activities. The documents accompanying the letter provided overwhelming evidence of the scope of the operation. Bank records, geological reports, and correspondence between various companies painted a picture of systematic fraud that dwarfed anything Jed could have imagined. More troubling was the revelation that the operation had corrupted officials at multiple levels of government. Mining regulators, bank examiners, and even some law enforcement personnel had been compromised through bribes or intimidation. Ezra's investigation had identified the key players, but had also revealed how difficult it would be to prosecute them through normal channels. That's where Sheriff Grayson comes in, Jed said, looking up from the documents to find the lawman, watching him with patient understanding. Ezra contacted me about 2 years ago, Grayson explained. Started with some concerns about unusual activity in the mountains, but it became clear pretty quickly that we were dealing with something beyond local jurisdiction. I've been feeding information to federal contacts while helping Ezra document what was happening here. The collaboration explained the sheriff's timely arrival during the evening's confrontation. Grayson had been monitoring the situation, waiting for the criminal organization to make moves that would expose their operations to official scrutiny. The problem, Grayson continued, is that we still don't know how deep the corruption goes. Ezra was working on identifying which federal agencies could be trusted, but he died before completing that assessment. We've been operating on the assumption that local law enforcement was our safest option. Jed found himself struggling to process the magnitude of what he'd inherited. The treasure chest beneath the floorboards wasn't just Ezra's retirement savings. It was evidence in a federal investigation that could expose a criminal network worth hundreds of millions of dollars. What happens now? He asked, though he suspected the answer would involve risks he wasn't prepared to accept. Grayson retrieved a thick folder from the hidden compartment and placed it on the table beside Ezra's letter. Now we finish what Ezra started. He identified the key players and documented their operations, but we need someone to step forward as a witness who can testify about what he discovered. The folder contained detailed profiles of the people involved in the money laundering operation, including several names that Jed recognized from recent encounters. David Kellerman and James Chen, the corporate representatives who'd visited him earlier, were identified as mid-level operatives in a network that extended across multiple states. More shocking was the identification of Marcus Webb, the security consultant who'd threatened him that evening. According to Ezra's research, Webb was a former military officer who'd been dishonorably discharged for involvement in weapons trafficking. His current employer, Apex Development Group, was a front company that provided enforcement services for criminal organizations. These people killed Ezra, didn't they? Jed asked, though the question was more statement than inquiry. Grayson's expression confirmed his suspicion. We can't prove it yet, but the timing of his heart attack was remarkably convenient for people who needed his investigation to disappear. Ezra was in excellent health for a man his age, and he'd been taking precautions against exactly this kind of situation. The revelation transformed Jed's understanding of his inheritance once again. He hadn't just received property and mining claims. He'd inherited a war against criminals who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their operations. The good news, Grayson continued, is that Ezra's documentation is thorough enough to build a federal case. The bad news is that we need someone willing to step forward and claim ownership of his evidence, someone who can testify about how they came to possess information about the criminal network. Someone like the heir to his property, Jed said, understanding the full scope of the responsibility that had fallen to him. Exactly, but I want you to understand what you'd be getting into. These people have killed to protect their operation, and they won't hesitate to do it again. We can provide some protection, but taking on this kind of criminal organization involves real risks. Buck, who'd been unusually quiet during the conversation, suddenly stood and moved to the front window. His low growl suggested that their evening wasn't over, and that the decisions Jed was being asked to make might be more urgent than anyone had anticipated. Through the window, they could see lights moving through the forest again, but this time the pattern was different. Instead of the careful surveillance they'd observed before, these lights moved with the systematic precision of people conducting a search operation. They're not waiting for your decision, Grayson observed grimly. Looks like they've decided to escalate the situation tonight. As the lights grew closer, Jed realized that the time for careful consideration had passed entirely. The criminal organization that had killed Ezra was moving to eliminate the threat his evidence represented, and the choices available were becoming increasingly stark. The plot twist that revealed Ezra's true identity and the scope of the criminal investigation had transformed a simple inheritance story into something far more dangerous. Now, with hostile forces closing in on the cabin, Jed faced decisions that would determine not just his own fate, but the success or failure of a federal investigation that could expose a massive criminal enterprise. The lights in the forest moved with military precision, converging on the cabin from 3 different directions in a pattern that suggested coordinated assault training. Grayson immediately moved to the radio equipment Ezra had hidden in the fireplace compartment, his fingers working with practiced efficiency to establish contact with backup units. "This is Sheriff Grayson requesting immediate assistance at the Boone property," he spoke into the handset. "Multiple armed subjects approaching, federal investigation in progress. Need state patrol and FBI response." The response crackled back through static. "Sheriff, this is dispatch. We show no federal investigation active in your jurisdiction. Can you confirm your request?" Grayson's expression darkened as he realized the implications of the dispatcher's response. Either the federal investigation had been compromised at the communications level, or someone was actively blocking official response to their situation. Dispatch, disregard federal reference. Multiple armed trespassers on private property. Officer needs assistance. How long for backup? Nearest unit is 40 minutes out, Sheriff. Weather's slowing response times on the mountain roads. 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours given their current circumstances. The lights in the forest had stopped moving, suggesting that whoever was approaching had reached their assault positions and was preparing for coordinated action. Jed found himself drawing on training he hadn't used in decades, his mind automatically shifting into the tactical planning mode that had kept him alive in Vietnam. The cabin's defensive position was both blessing and curse. The elevated location provided good sight lines but limited escape routes. "How many weapons did Ezra keep here?" he asked Grayson, who was still working with the radio equipment. "Enough," the sheriff replied, revealing a cache of firearms that had been hidden alongside the communication gear. "Your cousin believed in being prepared for exactly this kind of situation." The weapons were modern and well-maintained. 2 rifles with night vision scopes, several handguns, and what appeared to be tactical gear designed for extended operations. Everything bore the hallmarks of federal issue, confirming that Ezra's background was exactly what his letter had claimed. Buck's behavior had shifted into full alert mode, his attention moving between the 3 directions from which the lights had approached. The dog's senses provided early warning capabilities that no electronic system could match, and his growing agitation suggested that the assault would begin soon. "Jed," Grayson said, abandoning the radio after several more unsuccessful attempts to establish reliable contact, "I need you to understand something. If we don't survive tonight, Ezra's investigation dies with us. These people have spent 2 years trying to eliminate the evidence he gathered, and killing us would solve their problems permanently." The weight of responsibility settled on Jed's shoulders like a physical burden. In the space of a few hours, he'd gone from simple retiree to the key witness in a federal investigation that could expose hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal activity. The transition was surreal, but the approaching lights made it undeniably real. "What's the plan?" Jed asked, checking the action on one of Ezra's rifles. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, muscle memory from decades past returning with disturbing ease. "Survive until backup arrives," Grayson replied grimly, "and hope that some of the federal contacts Ezra identified are still trustworthy." The sheriff activated what appeared to be an emergency beacon hidden among Ezra's equipment. The device would broadcast their location and situation to federal agencies, but there was no way to know which agencies would receive the signal or how they would respond. "How many people are we dealing with?" Jed asked, trying to assess the tactical situation objectively. "Based on the light patterns, I'd estimate 8 to 12 operatives. Professional level, given their approach tactics. Probably the same team that's been conducting surveillance for the past week." The numbers weren't encouraging. Even with defensive advantages and superior weapons, 2 men and a dog couldn't hold off a dozen trained attackers indefinitely. Their only hope lay in creating enough delay for outside assistance to arrive. Jed began implementing defensive preparations that came back to him as if 40 years hadn't passed. Furniture was repositioned to create firing positions with overlapping fields of view. Windows were partially blocked to prevent easy targeting while maintaining shooting lanes. Emergency supplies were positioned for quick access during extended engagement. The most important preparation was psychological. Combat effectiveness depended as much on mental readiness as physical capability, and Jed found himself entering the focused calm that had served him well in previous conflicts. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. Survival required clear thinking and precise action. Grayson proved to be equally prepared for the situation, his movements showing familiarity with tactical operations that went beyond normal law enforcement. Training, His positioning and weapon handling suggested military background, confirming that Ezra had chosen his local ally carefully. "Sheriff," Jed said during a brief lull in their preparations, "what's your real background? You're not just a small-town lawman." 20 years Army Special Forces before I came home to Pine Ridge," Grayson replied, without taking his eyes off the forest. "Ezra knew about my background when he approached me. Said he needed someone who understood both local politics and federal operations." The revelation explained the sheriff's competence and his willingness to involve himself in a federal investigation. Like Jed, he was a veteran who'd found himself drawn back into conflicts he'd thought were behind him. Buck's sudden alertness signaled the beginning of the assault. The dog positioned himself near the back door, his attention focused on sounds that human ears couldn't detect. Whatever was about to happen, it would begin from the direction that had concerned Buck most. The attack, when it came, demonstrated the professionalism Grayson had predicted. Instead of a direct assault, the attackers began with psychological warfare designed to undermine their target's confidence and force mistakes. Spotlights suddenly blazed from the forest, flooding the cabin with harsh white light that eliminated night vision and created stark shadows. The lights were positioned to prevent accurate return fire while making the defenders easy targets for anyone with proper equipment. Simultaneously, amplified voices began broadcasting from multiple directions, creating confusion about the number and location of the attackers. The voices demanded surrender, promising safe treatment in exchange for cooperation, but their tone carried the falseness of people making promises they had no intention of keeping. "Jedediah Boone," one voice called across the clearing, "you're surrounded by federal agents conducting a legitimate investigation. Come out with your hands visible, and this situation can be resolved peacefully." The claim of federal authority was designed to create doubt and confusion, but Jed's conversation with Grayson had prepared him for exactly this kind of deception. Real federal agents would have identified themselves through proper channels and would have coordinated with local law enforcement. "They're trying to shake our confidence," Grayson observed, adjusting his position to counter the spotlight's effect. "Standard psychological operations means they're not confident about taking us by force." The assessment was encouraging, but didn't change their fundamental situation. Psychological warfare typically preceded physical assault, and the attackers were probably using the distraction to move into better positions for the real attack. Buck's behavior provided crucial intelligence about the attackers' movements. The dog's attention shifted systematically as different threats moved through the forest, giving the defenders advance warning about changes in the tactical situation. "Movement on the left flank," Jed reported, watching Buck's body language. "Looks like they're trying to get around to the back door." Grayson adjusted his position to cover the potential breach point while maintaining observation of the main approaches. Their defensive coordination was improving with each passing minute, but time was working against them in the larger strategic picture. The radio crackled with intermittent transmissions, suggesting that word of their situation was beginning to reach outside authorities. Unfortunately, the responses indicated confusion about jurisdiction and authority that could delay effective assistance for hours. "This is FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen requesting immediate status update on Sheriff Grayson's location," came one transmission that caught both men's attention. "That's Morrison's contact," Grayson said, referring to the geologist who'd been working with Ezra. "She might be legitimate federal response." The possibility of genuine assistance was encouraging, but it also created new tactical considerations. If legitimate federal agents were responding, the attackers might escalate their assault to complete their mission before official intervention could occur. As if responding to his thoughts, the psychological warfare suddenly stopped, and the spotlights were extinguished. The forest returned to darkness, but the silence was more ominous than the previous chaos had been. Buck's growling intensified, and his attention focused on the front of the cabin with laser-like intensity. Whatever was coming next would test their defensive preparations to the limit. "Here they come," Grayson said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd faced similar situations before. In the distance, the sound of helicopter rotors began to grow audible, suggesting that federal response was indeed mobilizing. But the aircraft was still several minutes away, and the attack that Buck's senses had detected was about to begin immediately. The climax of their confrontation was approaching with the inevitability of a mountain storm. All the preparation, planning, and tactical positioning would soon be tested against an enemy that had already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their criminal enterprise. Jed found himself thinking about the strange series of events that had brought him to this moment, from inheriting a simple cabin to defending a federal investigation against organized criminals. The transformation seemed impossible, but the weight of the rifle in his hands and Buck's protective presence beside him made it undeniably real. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just their survival, but the fate of Ezra's investigation and the criminal network it threatened to expose. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure wasn't an option either of them could afford to consider. The assault began with precision that confirmed Grayson's assessment of their opponent's professionalism. 3 separate teams moved simultaneously against the cabin's defensive perimeter, their coordination indicating extensive training and battlefield experience. The first explosion shattered the front window as a flashbang grenade detonated in the main room, filling the space with blinding light and deafening noise designed to disorient the defenders. Jed had anticipated this tactic and closed his eyes at the first sign of movement, protecting his night vision while trusting Buck's senses to guide his initial response. The dog's bark indicated threats approaching from 2 directions simultaneously: the blown-out front window and the back door where someone was working to breach the lock. Grayson moved to counter the rear threat, while Jed positioned himself to cover the main room. Through the ringing in his ears, Jed could hear the systematic approach of the assault team. These weren't desperate criminals making panicked attacks. They were professionals executing a carefully planned operation with military precision. The first attacker through the front window moved with textbook tactical discipline, using the furniture for cover while scanning for targets. Jed's position behind the stone fireplace gave him both protection and a clear field of fire, advantages he used without hesitation. The rifle's report echoed through the cabin like thunder, and the attacker went down immediately, but his teammates were already following through the breach, forcing Jed to shift position to avoid return fire that splintered the stonework around his head. Buck's warning bark from the kitchen indicated that Grayson was engaged with the rear assault team. The sound of splintering wood suggested they'd abandoned subtlety in favor of explosive entry, bringing the battle to both ends of the cabin simultaneously. Jed's military training served him well as he moved through the defensive positions they'd prepared. Each piece of furniture had been placed to provide both cover and firing lanes, creating a maze that favored defenders who knew the layout while hindering attackers operating in unfamiliar territory. The second attacker through the window proved more cautious than his teammate, using smoke grenades to obscure visibility while advancing through the room. The tactic was effective but not perfect. Buck's keen senses tracked movement that human. Eyes couldn't follow through the artificial fog. "Left side, moving toward the kitchen," Jed called to Grayson, his voice carrying the clipped precision of combat communication. The sheriff's response was immediate gunfire that indicated he was dealing with multiple threats simultaneously. The defensive coordination they'd planned was holding, but the attacker's numerical advantage was beginning to tell. A new sound entered the combat symphony, the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors growing rapidly louder. Federal backup was approaching, but whether it would arrive in time to affect the outcome remained uncertain. The attackers seemed to recognize the approaching helicopters as well, because their assault intensified with desperate urgency. No longer content with careful tactical advancement, they began using explosive charges to create new breach points in the cabin's walls. The explosion that destroyed the east wall filled the air with splinters and debris, creating a gaping hole that exposed Jed's flank position. He rolled away from the falling timber just as automatic weapons fire raked the area where he'd been positioned seconds before. Buck's protective instincts overcame his training as the dog charged toward the new breach, his growling bark warning the attackers that they faced more than just human opposition. The sight of a large, angry dog emerging from the smoke and debris created a moment of hesitation that Jed exploited ruthlessly. His return fire drove the assault team back from the breach, but he could see more attackers moving through the forest beyond. The numbers were even worse than Grayson had estimated. At least 15 operatives were visible in the tree line, with potentially more in reserve. "Grayson, we need to consider fallback positions," Jed called, recognizing that their current defensive stance couldn't hold against such overwhelming numbers. "Negative," the sheriff replied, between bursts of gunfire. "We hold here until backup arrives. Ezra's evidence is in this cabin, and we can't let them destroy it." The reminder of what they were truly defending transformed Jed's tactical thinking. This wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting evidence that could expose a criminal network worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Retreat wasn't an option if it meant allowing the attackers to destroy Ezra's investigation. The helicopter sound was growing louder, but so was the intensity of the assault. More explosive charges detonated around the cabin's perimeter, systematically destroying their defensive positions while creating multiple breach points for the final assault. Through the smoke and chaos, Jed could see Marcus Webb directing the attack from the forest edge. The former military officer was coordinating his teams with hand signals, positioning them for what appeared to be a final, overwhelming assault. Buck returned to Jed's position, his fur singed, but his fighting spirit undiminished. The dog's loyalty under fire reminded Jed of why he'd chosen this life of simple companionship, and why he was willing to fight to protect it. The sound of approaching helicopters was now unmistakable, and searchlights began sweeping the forest from above. But Webb's final assault was already underway, with his remaining operatives moving toward the cabin from all directions simultaneously. The final assault came from all directions at once, a coordinated attack that tested every aspect of their defensive preparation. Webb's teams moved with desperate efficiency, knowing that the approaching helicopters represented their last chance to eliminate the threat Ezra's evidence posed to their criminal enterprise. Jed found himself engaged in the most intense firefight of his life, including his combat tours in Vietnam. The attackers showed no regard for casualties, pressing forward through defensive fire with the determination of people who understood that failure meant life imprisonment or worse. The cabin's interior had become a maze of destruction, with smoke, debris, and the constant muzzle flashes of weapons, creating a surreal landscape that shifted constantly as the battle progressed. Jed moved through this chaos with the fluid grace of someone whose muscle memory had been honed by decades of experience. Buck remained at his side throughout the engagement, the dog's protective instincts overriding any concern for his own safety. When one attacker managed to reach the fireplace where Ezra's evidence was hidden, Buck's charge bought Jed the crucial seconds needed to eliminate the threat before the criminal could destroy the investigation materials. Grayson's voice carried across the chaos, coordinating their defensive efforts with tactical precision. "Two more coming through the back, moving to flank your position." The sheriff's warning allowed Jed to reposition before the flanking maneuver could succeed, but their ammunition was running low and the attackers seemed to have unlimited resources. Each defeated assault was immediately followed by another, pressing them toward inevitable defeat through sheer attrition. The helicopters were now directly overhead, their powerful searchlights flooding the clearing with daylight-bright illumination. Through the cabin's destroyed walls, Jed could see federal agents rappelling from the aircraft, their tactical gear and coordinated movements marking them as legitimate law enforcement rather than additional attackers. Webb apparently recognized the same thing, because his assault teams suddenly shifted tactics from overwhelming attack to fighting withdrawal. The professional criminals had no intention of engaging federal agents in a pitched battle that would only result in their capture or death, but Webb himself remained committed to completing his mission. While his teams began their retreat through the forest, the former military officer made a final, desperate assault on the cabin's main room, apparently determined to destroy Ezra's evidence even at the cost of his own life. The confrontation between Webb and Jed became personal in a way that transcended the larger battle raging around them. Both men were veterans who understood tactics, weapons, and the psychology of combat. Their engagement was a chess match, played with automatic weapons in a confined space filled with smoke and debris. Webb's superior equipment and recent combat experience gave him significant advantages, but Jed's intimate knowledge of the cabin's layout and his partnership with Buck created unexpected tactical opportunities. When Webb focused on eliminating Jed, Buck attacked from an unexpected angle. When Webb tried to deal with the dog, Jed's position allowed devastating return fire. The federal agent's entry into the cabin came at the crucial moment when both Jed and Webb had exhausted their ammunition and were engaged in hand-to-hand combat near the fireplace. Buck's intervention had prevented Webb from reaching Ezra's evidence, but the criminal's desperation had escalated to the point where he was willing to use explosive charges to destroy both the evidence and anyone protecting it. FBI, drop your weapons! The amplified command filled the cabin as tactical teams secured the perimeter and began systematically clearing the building. Webb's response was to produce what appeared to be a grenade, his intention clearly to destroy himself along with Ezra's investigation materials rather than face capture and prosecution. The weapon would eliminate everyone in the main room while ensuring that the criminal network's secrets died with its protectors. Buck's final intervention was both heroic and decisive. The old dog launched himself at Webb just as the grenade's pin was pulled, knocking the device away from the fireplace and toward the cabin's destroyed front wall. The explosion that followed destroyed what remained of the building's facade, but left the evidence cache intact. The blast knocked everyone in the room unconscious, but when Jed awakened in federal custody 20 minutes later, he found himself surrounded by legitimate FBI agents who confirmed that Ezra's evidence had been successfully secured. Webb had died in the explosion, but the materials needed to prosecute his criminal network had survived. Buck, miraculously, had also survived the blast, though he required immediate veterinary attention for his injuries. The dog's courage had not only saved Jed's life, but had preserved the investigation that would ultimately expose hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal activity. As federal agents carefully extracted Ezra's evidence from its hiding place, Jed realized that his inheritance had proven to be far more valuable than anyone could have imagined. The broken-down cabin that the townspeople had mocked had become the foundation for one of the largest criminal prosecutions in the region's history. The immediate danger was over, but the long-term implications of the night's events were just beginning to unfold. 6 months after the battle at Ezra's cabin, Jed stood in the same clearing where it had all begun, watching construction crews work on the foundation of his new home. The old cabin was gone, destroyed beyond repair by the night's violence, but the land remained. More importantly, the truth about Ezra's life and work had finally been told. Buck sat beside him, the dog's recovery from his injuries nearly complete. The veterinarian had called it miraculous that such an old dog had survived. The explosion with only minor burns and a temporary hearing loss. Jed preferred to think of it as the reward for a lifetime of loyalty and courage when it mattered most. The federal investigation that had grown from Ezra's evidence had exceeded everyone's expectations. The money laundering network, exposed by his cousin's documentation, had led to indictments across 6 states and 3 countries. Over 24 people had been arrested, including several government officials whose corruption had enabled the criminal enterprise to operate for years. The mining claims that had started everything remained valid and valuable, but their importance had been overshadowed by their role in exposing criminal activity. Jed had ultimately decided to develop the claims in partnership with legitimate mining companies, ensuring that the wealth Ezra had discovered would benefit the entire Pine Ridge community rather than enriching criminals. Sheriff Grayson approached. From the direction of the road, his patrol car parked beside Jed's new pickup truck. The sheriff had become more than an ally during the months of federal investigation that followed the attack. He'd become the kind of friend Jed hadn't realized he'd been missing. "Morning, Jed," Grayson said, joining him in observing the construction progress. "Looks like they're making good time on the foundation work. Should be ready for winter," Jed replied, scratching behind Buck's ears. "Been thinking about Ezra a lot lately. Wonder what he'd make of all this." The question had occupied Jed's thoughts throughout the legal proceedings that had followed the attack. Ezra's investigation had been thorough and professional, but it had also been deeply personal. The man had spent years of his life documenting criminal activity that was destroying communities like Pine Ridge, and he died protecting evidence that would ultimately bring justice. "I think he'd be proud," Grayson said simply. The network he exposed was responsible for a lot of damage beyond just money laundering. Drug trafficking, weapons sales, human trafficking, the evidence you helped preserve is going to put some very bad people away for a very long time. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle, a sedan that bore federal government plates. FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen stepped out, her professional demeanor softened by the smile she reserved for people she'd come to consider allies rather than just witnesses. "Mr. Boone, Sheriff," she said, approaching with a manila envelope in her hand. "I have some news I thought you'd want to hear in person." Agent Chen had been the federal contact Morrison had recommended, and she'd proven to be exactly the kind of trustworthy law enforcement professional Ezra had been seeking. Her integrity and competence had been crucial in ensuring that the investigation proceeded without the corruption that had compromised earlier efforts. "The final indictments came down yesterday," she continued, handing Jed the envelope. "Marcus Webb's organization has been completely dismantled. More importantly, the evidence trail led us to the people who ordered Ezra's death. They're going to spend the rest of their lives in federal prison." The news brought a satisfaction that Jed hadn't expected. Justice for Ezra's murder had seemed secondary to protecting his investigation, but the resolution of both cases provided a sense of completion that allowed him to move forward without the weight of unfinished business. "There's something else," Agent Chen added. "The Bureau has decided to recommend you for a Civilian Service Award. What you did that night saved not just a federal investigation, but potentially hundreds of lives that would have been lost to the criminal activities this network was facilitating." The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more to Jed was the knowledge that Ezra's sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose. The quiet mountain man who'd lived alone with his secrets had ultimately succeeded in exposing a criminal enterprise that stretched across international boundaries. As Agent Chen departed, Jed found himself reflecting on the unexpected turns his life had taken since inheriting what everyone had assumed was a worthless cabin. The mockery of the townspeople had given way to respect and gratitude, as the true nature of his inheritance became clear. The mining claims were generating enough income to support not just his own comfortable retirement, but community development, projects that would benefit Pine Ridge for generations. The new school, the improved medical clinic, and the expanded fire department all owed their existence to resources that had been hidden beneath a cabin everyone had dismissed as junk More importantly, Jed had found something he hadn't known. He was looking for a sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from his wandering years. The community that had welcomed him as a stranger had embraced him as a neighbor, and the land that had appeared worthless had proven to hold riches beyond imagination. Buck's sudden alertness drew Jed's attention to the road, where Martha Henderson's truck was approaching with a passenger. As the vehicle stopped, Jed saw that she'd brought one of the new teachers from the school, a young woman who'd moved to Pine Ridge to help educate the community's children using resources made possible by the mining development. "Afternoon, Jed," Martha called with the warmth that had made her diner the heart of the community. "Thought you might like to hear how the new science lab is working out. The kids are learning about geology now, thanks to the equipment the mining partnership provided." The conversation that followed reinforced Jed's conviction that he'd made the right choices about his inheritance. The wealth Ezra had discovered was being used to build a stronger community rather than enriching distant corporations or criminal enterprises. As the sun began to set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jed realized that the broken-down cabin had indeed contained a treasure far greater than gold coins or precious stones. It had held the foundation for a life of meaning, purpose, and genuine human connection. Buck stretched contentedly beside him, the old dog's presence a reminder that the best treasures in life often came in forms that others might overlook or dismiss. Sometimes what appeared worthless to the casual observer held riches that could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The mockery had turned to gratitude. The junk cabin had become a cornerstone of justice, and the surprise that Buck had uncovered had proven bigger than anyone could have imagined.